Okay, so this evening we're gathered to talk about the Bhagavad-Gita, which is a story very important to the human journey. To begin, I'll ring the bell, we'll sit quietly, and then I'll say thank you for the quiet time, and we'll go into our discussion together. If it helps you in sitting quietly, you're welcome to close your eyes or to gaze down so your eyes are one sense that's less distracted. Also, if it helps you to feel more centered, you might turn your palms either face down on your knees or your thighs, or you can cup one hand in the palm of the other hand and rest them just in front of the lower belly. And lengthen your spine and slightly tip your chin down and in towards your throat. If you find that as you sit quietly, your mind is restless or distracted, you might begin with an invitation, inviting your mind to quiet. If inviting isn't a strong enough strategy, you may focus your mind on something very tangible in the here and now, such as the exhale into the exhale pause. To have a place for your mental focus to keep returning, like when the exhale becomes the exhale pause, helps you to cultivate a kind of exquisite attention for the present moment. And then less interest in habitual mental chatter. You may continue to invite your mind to rest in stillness or quiet. And even if there is habitual mental chatter around the edges, explore the exhale, becoming your exhale pause. You join your hands together in Anjali Mudra. And with appreciation for your efforts to be here this evening, as well as the efforts of others, which brings us together in community, you may bow your head to your heart. And release your hands and open your eyes. Thank you, Tristan. There's additional blankets outside this room if you need something more to sit on. There are also blocks on the shelf up here next to me and Dell if you'd like to have more support. So what I'll outline here as I write on the board, often when we're writing in America and in a linear fashion, we make the list from the top down. But because this is a journey of a person's awakening, I'm going to write from the bottom up. So I'm going to start here where Arjuna, who's the main character for us to be interested in the Bhagavad-Gita, he's the main character in the first part of the story. And the first chapter is called Arjuna's Despondency. And so we're going to begin here. So a little background on how Arjuna ends up in this moment in his life. And the background is helpful to understand because each of us is walking this journey in some way ourselves as humans. Arjuna is one of 5 brothers. He happens to be the middle brother. 2 of his brothers are twins, and then he's got 2 additional brothers. So he's sandwiched in between. He represents the 3rd chakra, which is also the center of will, the center of agency or willfulness in America. In the Indian mythology, it's really the center of willingness. And those are really different words. To be willful is very different than to be willing. Well, Arjuna and his brothers, 12 years prior to this moment, they were engaging in a gambling match with their cousins. And what they were gambling was the kingdom on the roll of the dice. So the kingdom in the story represents the kingdom of your life, or what we would really say very specifically, the kingdom of your Dharma. So your Dharma means when you're in balance, when you experience grace and love and consciousness, and when the sense of your own personhood is a vessel for the purpose of your life, then your Dharma is working. When your personhood is getting in the way of your Dharma, it's not working. It's like blocking it without realizing that you're the one blocking it. So Arjuna and his brothers and the cousins were gambling with dice. This is a pretty risky gamble because what they put up on the table to gamble was the entire kingdom. And Arjuna and his brothers lost. They lost the whole kingdom. The gambling was happening at a time when the life was out of balance enough that gambling looked like a good idea. Now, in our culture, as I study addiction here in the West, one of the things we know about gambling is that the anticipation of winning stokes the dopamine receptors in the brain. And anticipation feels really good to the human brain. The anticipation of pleasure, which is part of dopamine's response as a biochemical support in your brain. You need just enough dopamine to anticipate life is going to be worth living, but you don't need to be on a dopamine surge every couple minutes while you're gambling. Chronic gambling ends up being a bigger risk than people might realize when they get started, producing anxiety, depression, and loss of physical health and financial well-being too. So you can imagine that Arjuna and his brothers and the cousins across the way in this gamble had been out of balance just enough that they all thought this was a good idea. And on the roll of the dice, the kingdom was lost. Arjuna was born into a part of the Indian community where he was born as a warrior, so were his brothers. They were born to defend the Dharma, to protect and sustain the Dharma. But they just lost the match, and because they lost, they were sent off into exile for 12 years. They had to leave their community and go into the forest for 12 years. 12 is a certain number in India, like 12 times 9, 12 times other numbers adds up to auspicious other numbers. What is 12 times 9? 108, yeah, the magical number of the whole cosmos, according to some. I'll tell you more about that number some other time. So they went off for 12 years into the forest. 5 brothers. There are 5 sense organs in the human body. There are 5 organs of actions. There are 5 causes of suffering and 5 layers to the human system. And there are 5 brothers in the story. The number 5, Pancha, is very important in India and in Indian mythology. So these 5 brothers go for 12 years to the forest to do what? To practice their gambling skills? No. They went to practice meditation and breathing and their warrior skills for defending, sustaining, upholding, and protecting the Dharma. So they were on retreat for 12 years. I've told this story a lot when I go to Brighton Bush Hot Springs because we go away to be on retreat. And inevitably, on the last day of a retreat, people, when they're anticipating going home, they think about what they'll do when they get home. And sometimes I talk to the students prior to going home about not being disappointed if the other household members didn't wash all the dishes when you were gone, or if the cat hair didn't get swept up, or if the children were wearing the same clothes they wore on Thursday when you left, and if there's still some sort of mess on the dining room table that you thought somebody was going to take care of. You go home and try to go home without being disappointed. Well, Arjuna and his brothers, after 12 years of practice in the forest, they've been in exile, and now they're going home. And they arrive in the kingdom, and it's a mess. It's an absolute, utter mess. They left it for 12 years to the cousins who won the gambling match, who kept gambling, who kept risking the Dharma, who lived more in indulgence, in grasping, in desire, in personal pleasure, not social understanding, not dharmic understanding, but personal pleasures. So Arjuna and his 4 brothers go home and they see the kingdom is in a shambles. Now, how many of you have had the chance to be, let's say, away on a meditation retreat? You go for some silence or a yoga retreat and you find yourself feeling a measure of equanimity and grace and appreciation, and then you go home and something's not quite right at the house. Has anybody had this experience? Mm-hmm. And what happens when you get home and you see that things aren't as you would like them to be?
It's harder to be as peaceful and balanced as I was before I got home. So,
yeah. Yes. Maybe you feel disappointed.
You sure?
Uh-huh. What happens for you, Kate, when you get home?
I think my first instinct is somehow I will impart the wisdom I have gained onto the people here, and that will, somehow fix the problem.
Yes, okay, so disappointment and arrogance. Totally understandable, but not that skillful, right? What else happens when you get home and the kingdom, the household is more of a mess than you wanted it to be? Yes?
Well, I tried to clean up the mess and change my attitude so that the mess didn't bother me, so I could kind of work from both ends.
Yeah.
I failed in both counts.
Yeah, these are our strategies, and sometimes what happens is the equanimity instilled seems short-lived because it might flicker off when you see the mess in the household. And then we can get disappointed with ourselves about such short-lived equanimity. Let's hold that thought here for a moment. What happens as you're coming back from the forest retreat and you feel some measure of peace and love for yourself and humanity, and then somebody cuts you off in traffic? Do you say, "May you be free from unnecessary suffering," to the other driver?
I just experienced that. I just taught a class at 24 Hour Fitness where a man during meditation was, I don't know what he was doing, but the weight was like a lot of weight, and he like this, and he would drop them and then pick them up and then drop them. And one of the students got mad and ran out there and yelled at him. And then I went out and said, if you could give me just 2 minutes, I'll be finished with meditation, and then we'll be active and it won't seem so painful to them. And so I gave him the go ahead and go sign. We finished our class and sat, and I said, notice if you actually hear much now.
Mm-hmm.
There's still activity out there, but somehow this whole hour has given you such a connection with yourself that all those sounds, they aren't affecting you as much.
Mm-hmm.
And you can take this out into your day now. And with practice, this will be something that will be easily done.
Mm-hmm.
So, similar to what you're saying, it's about having some time to yourself, and then starting and being able to see, okay, well, I don't feel it as much. I spent some time focused. Can I take this with me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What can you internalize so it becomes the new go-to, the new place of centering or love or grace, out of which your life flows, rather than just adopting it as a temporary attitude when you're in practice or when you're in the forest retreat or when things are going your way, when humanity is behaving as you would like them to behave.
Or even I said, this man who's out there, can you send him compassion? Because we know he's going to start again. I gave him the go-ahead in 2 minutes. So can you send him compassion and that he'll be safe with the weight that he's using? And, can you sit and be compassionate of this human being who's just like us, another human doing the best he can? And I think that helped for them to realize, okay, that's another person. That could be like my son out there who's doing that. And so we had to work with it because it's pretty loud there at 24 Hour Fitness. I can be pretty loud. But we were able to really get a good practice after that.
There's a relatively famous story in the meditation community of the monks meditating skillfully, beautifully, having exalted experiences, and then the guy who's the sweeper, who sweeps the ashram or sweeps the meditation hall, comes by and is sweeping more noisily than the monks want him to sweep. So after several weeks of this annoying behavior on the part of the sweeper, the monks decide that they're going to exit the sweeper from the ashram without telling the lead teacher. They get him a ticket and they send him on, and he goes away. He's a humble servant, so he does as he's told to do, and the teacher says to the monks in residence, "Where's the sweeper?" "Oh, we sent him away. It's much quieter now. We're having better meditation." So the lead teacher goes to the train station to get the sweeper to bring him back so he can sweep more. You understand? The lead teacher brought the sweeper back to sweep double times of day. Not fewer times of day, not more quietly, double the times of day to sweep the ashram, to sweep the meditation hall so that the monks could improve their meditation. They felt they would improve if the sweeper was gone. Lead teacher said, no, we'll improve if the sweeper stays, because what you're working with is your own annoyance. You're working with your expectations of how this should be. So what happens for Arjuna and his brothers when they come back to the kingdom and they see that it's an atrocity, it's been, of their cousins, there are 100 cousins, and those 100 cousins have been indulging in every sense pleasure, in every way in which the human mind goes out of balance. If you were at Brightbush, you heard me say that the mind of the human can go out of balance in 99 ways, plus the 100th cousin is responsible for the ways in which the human mind wants to have psychological battle. That one cousin is born to different parents than the other 99 cousins who have the same parents. You can look at the family tree of the brotherhood in some of the books about the Gita. So this one cousin is fanning the fire for the other 99 ways in which the human mind goes out of balance to be more extreme. So Arjuna and his brothers come back and they say, oh my God, what's happened here? This is a mess. We lost more than we thought we lost. We went away, we studied, we're back now. We are aghast at what you've done with the kingdom. It's fallen to pieces. And as this is occurring, Arjuna is assigned with the task of reconciling the kingdom to bring it back to Dharma. And he's told that to do that, he has to go into battle against his 99 plus 1 cousins. He's actually told he has to slay them. Means he has to go to battle against them and kill them. And many people right there interpret that the Bhagavad-Gita is actually a story about war and killing and violence. But it's a story about reconciling in the human mind the parts that are out of balance enough that you're experiencing adharma, means the absence of dharma. Adharma is when we're out of balance, unskillful, inauspicious. We're actually causing harm to self and others. We're indulging without realizing the risk to us, or we're reacting or avoiding without realizing the risk or the expense to us. And we're going in the directions that lead away from our dharma, that lead us away from love and grace. Yet we don't know it, because we're being led by the sense impressions. There are 5 senses, and the sense impressions times 5 organs of action, times 5 causes of suffering, times 5 layers in the human system. It just keeps multiplying until we are no longer our best self. So Arjuna is pushed out there in the front of his 4 brothers, whose names are Sahadeva, Nakula, Bhima, and Yudhishthira. And you can imagine them sort of nudging Arjuna to the forefront, saying, you go do it. We have your back, don't worry. We're back here. You go to battle out there. And Arjuna, as he sees the circumstances, falls into despondency and is paralyzed. So despondency here is bigger than disappointment. It's bigger than arrogance. It's bigger than frustration. Despondency is bigger than any strategy you could come up with. It's the realization that none of your strategies are going to work. That's a pretty big realization, that none of your strategies are going to work. The strategies that most of us make mentally come out of our conditioning and our habits. And they are designed to protect what we've already outgrown, rather than to nourish the Dharma to come through us. I'll say that again. The strategies that most of us have come up with were designed out of our conditioning to protect that which we're already outgrowing. So to protect who you were when you were 6 or 10 or 17. To still keep protecting those vulnerable parts of yourself now when you're beyond 20, beyond 30, beyond 40 years into your life. That's called outdated. And yet our defense mechanisms, we made them at a time when we needed them, and we got to practice them a lot. So the strategies we made out of conditioned mind and out of the urge to protect our basic survival became outdated and are protecting aspects of us that we've already outgrown but forgot that we did it. So, and rather than those kinds of strategies, we need the skills that help to nourish the Dharma to come through us. And I'd like to make a distinction between the word strategy and the word skill, because strategy is generally defensive. Sometimes it's offensive, like on the football team. There's a defense and there's an offense, but it's still playing the game, looking at how I'm going to win. And skills, I call them life skills, are ways that let the Dharma then come through us, like the dance coming through the artist or the music through the flute, or the skill of the potter who's tending just enough to the pot that it gets created through them, not because of them. So Arjuna walks onto the battlefield with the skills he's been generating in the forest for 12 years. He wasn't prepared to be so aghast at the condition, however. And in his despondency, he does one very wise thing, which is recommended to humans everywhere, past, present, and future. He calls on his teacher, whose name in the story is Krishna. So Arjuna calls on Krishna, and the way that he gets Krishna's attention is he taps him on the toe, while Krishna is pretending to be sleeping. Now, Krishna is pretending to be sleeping, because either team, the cousins or Arjuna, could ask Krishna to be their teacher. And Krishna was sly enough that he wanted it to be Arjuna. So he was pretending to be asleep when the cousins asked for Krishna to be their teacher. But when Arjuna tapped him on the toe, he woke up. He said, "Okay, how can I help you?" This means your inner teacher is much wiser than you are. And if your strategies, if your 99 strategies plus your one urge to give rise to psychological battle, if they think they're asking for your teacher to help, that teacher that's most wise in us will pretend to be asleep. And when your vulnerable, open, aghast, heartbroken self asks for the teacher to come, that the teacher comes. When you're in Arjuna's position, then the teacher comes. Have any of you found that the teacher comes when you're more heartbroken? Some of you are nodding yes. When your strategies have stopped working and your heart feels overwhelmed, you feel despondent like this. It's very humbling. And if we ask for the teacher, we might get a silent response. We might get a wordless response. We might just get the response of this quiet presence. We may be leaning into the unknown. It's a good place to lean. So in despondency, there are ways that the human mind would navigate that here in the West. In the third chakra, it's the center for will. Sometimes in the West here, when we feel despondent, we get more willful. We want to be more powerful. We start fighting for what's ours. We might set up better boundaries, get more determined. We might make new plans on clean sheets of paper. Do you know what I'm talking about? We might decide to get more rigorous, to be more self-determined. So that's in the perspective that yoga brings. That would be called an unskillful use of your will. Willfulness from the third chakra goes out horizontally like this. So out from here into the world to kind of attack it, to claim it, to organize it, to get it together, to make your mark. But the other thing that can happen is people back up from their will entirely and they retreat, they recede. They get smaller. And the fire of the third chakra, which is the element of fire, starts to smolder in them. And there's little to no sense of will. That isn't more or less skillful than too much willfulness. This is the other side of the spectrum, so too much or too little. But what's actually being asked of Arjuna right there in his despondency is willingness. He is not ready for willingness at this juncture in the Gita, but he comes to it as the story goes on. And how does he get there? Once he asks for Krishna to be his teacher, I like to say Krishna's a little... he's kind-hearted, he's got perspective, he has a lot to offer to his student, and he sees his student for who he is. And he teaches very wisely to his student, who is consistently petulant for the first several chapters in the Gita. By petulant, I mean like this. Arjuna says, I don't want to do it. I don't want this dharma, give it to somebody else. This isn't my task. I don't believe in killing. I'm not set up for this. I don't want to be a warrior anymore. I'm going to choose inaction. And Krishna kindly says back to him, well, this is your dharma. This is the task at hand. The kingdom depends on you, and there's no such thing as inaction. Actions are always occurring. Even choosing inaction is an action of itself. And so as Krishna is talking to his student, if you've ever read like a Zen koan, you might hear him turning a Zen koan in circles. That's how Arjuna experiences it, and his petulance shows up like this. Wait a minute. You said it was like this. Now you're saying it's this way. If it's either going to be A or B, Krishna, you can imagine like a teenager talking to a parent. You said this, now you're saying that. Now you're saying it could be C. And then Krishna introduces choice D, and Arjuna's like, A, B, C, or D, which is it going to be? You can almost imagine he's going to say, which is it going to be, buddy? Because his annoyance at the perceived meandering of his teacher's explanations, his annoyance is because his perspective is looking through his own small lens. I don't want to do this task. I don't want it to be like this. This is not the life I want to be living right now. Things are not according to my desires. I don't want to be in this moment as a human being in this kingdom. You've just given me 4 different options. None of them is going to work for me. He's making a little switch back like this, as if he were on a mountain. Back and forth, grooving his own resistance. Now, his resistance shows up as petulance, but his petulance will turn soon into earnestness. But while he's making that groove, his teacher is infinitely patient and calmly says, it's action or devotion or meditation or love. There are 4 paths to God, his teacher says to him. There are 4 paths to bringing the kingdom back into balance. You have 4 options here. You can choose the path of love. You could choose the path of meditation. You could choose the path of inquiry or contemplation. You could choose the path of action. And you, dear Arjuna, were chosen for action. You were trained as a warrior, as were your brothers, and it's your task to act on behalf of the Dharma. And while he's giving those 4 options, it's almost like the 5 blind men and the elephant. It's all elephant, but each of them has a different perspective on what that thing is. And they go back absolutely convinced of their own perspective. And the 5 blind men tell their community what they just experienced, and none of them actually has it right. They all have a piece of the elephant. There are 4 paths to God outlined in the Bhagavad-Gita, and I'll talk about them individually much more tomorrow morning. But you can imagine if Arjuna is like standing, arms crossed, turned away from his teacher, who keeps telling him, here's another path to God, and here's another option, and another one, that like an inner petulant teenager, he's getting annoyed that the teacher, quote unquote, the parent, isn't being more clear. Which is it, he says. And his teacher says again, if all actions are given selflessly, you will experience God. Or if you eat wisely and with gratitude, you'll experience God. Or if you sweep the floor, mindful of the act of sweeping, you'll experience God. You'll experience freedom or liberation. Or if you meditate and you realize that a clod of dirt and a gold nugget are the same, you'll be experiencing God. So each time that his teacher gives him an example or a question, it sounds to Arjuna like a Zen koan. Zen koans are questions asked to bring the mind into stillness and awe, but Arjuna keeps slipping into petulance and resistance. Then he starts, you can imagine him sort of dancing about his teacher a little bit, begging for something really specific. Does anybody know what that is? What he asks for from his teacher? Think of yourself as a teenager for a moment, and how you might ask your parents, why can't I have the car? Why can't I stay out after midnight? Why can't I go across India on a train when I'm 17 by myself? You're going to ask your parents for evidence about their perspective. Tell me why I can't do what I'm asking you to give me permission to do. Why can't I have the car? What is the evidence that I'm going to stay out too late, or I'm going to crash the car, or I'm going to get on that train in India and be lost forever? What's the evidence? So Arjuna is asking his teacher for evidence, and he keeps saying, all right, you say that it's like this, then show me. Show it to me. He says it many times, okay, show me, then show me. And Krishna decides that he's going to show Arjuna his actual self, his whole self. And that's where Arjuna gets to have what's called revelation. In other words, Krishna is revealed to his student. Revelation. Is it legible? And the revelation happens like this. Krishna shows himself to Arjuna, and at the moment he shows himself, first, Arjuna's hair stands on end and he has goosebumps and his eyes are wide like saucers because he sees Krishna as a million blazing suns, as the effulgence and luminosity and immense presence of light, of consciousness, of grace. Krishna shows himself to be all of that. And what also happens? If you know, feel free to say.
Time stops.
There's a standing still like the solstice, winter solstice. The word solstice means to stand still, and there's a standing still of sorts where Arjuna is awestruck to see Krishna's beauty, and time is suspended. Do you ever have that experience in a revelation of your own, where like time stopped happening? What also is revealed by Krishna to his student Arjuna? A million blazing suns and...
Is this a man? I'm guessing.
No, that is a guess. How about if I tell you? Do you know?
The
Angie?
darker side of things.
Yeah, so Krishna shows himself to be a million blazing suns and all that's ever lived or died. He sees in this revelation the immense beauty and also the violence, the destruction, the death of things, the experience of the Dharma going into a downward spiral as the kingdom is lost to the cousins. So Krishna shows him like a crystal ball. This is what happens. There's birth, there's sustaining life, there's the destruction of life, there's the end of life, and it happens again. And he shows him the whole cycle. And Arjuna starts to realize that this is a much bigger story than his own personal resistance. That this is revelatory. Life goes on, and the whole thing could be lost to adharma, to inauspiciousness, to unskillfulness, for generations if he doesn't act now. If he doesn't take his dharma seriously, he could be losing the kingdom essentially forever, to death and destruction. So when Krishna shows him that beauty, Arjuna is like, thank you. And then he starts to see the destruction and the blood and the gore. And he says, okay, fine, no, put it away. I don't want to see it. It's all right. I'm not looking anymore. Thank you. Thank you for the evidence. That's enough. And Krishna folds it back up and goes back to just being Krishna, rather than the whole vision of who he actually is. But the revelation was powerful enough that Arjuna felt terrified. and he experienced fear that became willingness. So this model rises from despondency through resistance to the revelation, to the terror, to the willingness. Now, it's quite likely that we as humans will cycle through this many times on the spiritual journey. And I'll tell you a story of my first iteration of this that I have conscious memory of. I went to a retreat. I've heard part of this story before. I think I lost my water glass. What did I do? Oh, thanks. Great. I went to a retreat when I was 19. It was a silent retreat for 10 days. I'm rushing that part of the story because I've said it many times before. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I wanted relief from suffering. I knew what I wanted out of the retreat. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. And the teacher, the lead teacher, whose name is Christopher Titmus, he was talking one night. He talked every night, but this one night was very specific to me. He was talking just to me. There were 110 people there, but he was talking to me. And he was talking in these poetic circles about consciousness and the Dharma and silencing the mind and coming into right speech as a way to experience clarity. And he gave examples of what wasn't right speech and what would be unskillful speech and gossip and harshness and criticism and not quite telling the whole truth or lying by omission. He gave a whole series of examples and how engaging in inauspicious speech was a drain on your energy and your Dharma and your clarity. And how it fed the ego instead of helping us to relax about the ego and so on and so forth. At the end of this particular talk, I felt this enormous chasm opening up like, oh my God, I'm 19 and that's what I've been doing for the last 7 years since I became an adolescent. You know, you talk about the other girls, or you talk about the boys, or you talk about your teachers, or your family members, or you complain, or you plan, you strategize. But we never really experienced just silent wonder together in my family, nor in my friendship circle. Not on my athletic teams. We were going to win the game. We didn't rest in silent wonder before the competition. We didn't rest in silent wonder at the dinner table at my house, nor in my college where I went to university. We didn't drop into that. And I was newly, at 19, I was newly part of a recovery community in the 12-step model. And we spent a lot of time talking about our past and what was wrong with our present and how we were going to apply the 12 steps to get out of that suffering. And I think the 12-step model is very helpful to people. My reflection here is not about the 12-step model, but about how we, at that time, were spending our conversations, which wasn't in silent wonder. So I thought, oh, wow, this is amazing. I'm going to rest in this silent wonder. And when I go home, I'm going to tell my specific friends who talk more than I think is helpful that we should talk less. So I had this big revelation. At first I was like terrified. How am I going to have friends? I'm never going to have friends if we're just going to rest in silent wonder together all the time. So I lived for the next few days on the retreat, and I went home with some measure of willingness to try to explain to my friends how we were now going to communicate more wisely. I was 19 and I had just spent 10 days in silence. I practiced formulating sentences in my head about how I would tell my friends we were going to have skillful speech. Like on Kate's model, right? But I didn't actually rehearse the words out loud in the company of my friends. I only rehearsed them in the silence of my own mind, feeling like Christopher Titmus will speak through me and it will all be fine. And my friends will understand and will live dharmically forever from there on forth. That is not what happened. I actually happened to go home on the day of Hurricane Bob, which was in the city of Boston, and I didn't have any access to news during the retreat, so I didn't know that it was Hurricane Bob. And I walked out to the public transportation to get on the bus, to go to the T, to go to my job setting where some of these friends existed, and nobody was there. So my first effort was thwarted. I couldn't tell them of my revelation. Then I went home to tape the windows because the news was saying, tape the windows, it's Hurricane Bob. When I finally did speak to my friends, I, of course, blundered that experience, and I lost some friendships in my enthusiasm for what I had learned, but my lack of skill in articulating it. I lost some friendships. I'm sure there's forgiveness for that at this point, some almost 30 years later now. But it's to say, sometimes we have our revelation, and we have the trepidation that goes with it, like, how will I live that? I would recommend resting in the revelation a little longer. We tend to go in our culture from revelation to action. And we may not have practiced living it enough that when we go tell our friends or family members, or we start living more according to our revelation, we might not be embodying it all that well. Old habits are still there. Voice tone is important. Body language means something even if you've got perfectly articulated new understanding. If body language and voice tone aren't behind that, if love isn't present in the communication, you can really mess something up. So each of these can actually cause you to fall back to despondency if you're not experiencing them skillfully. So revelation becomes impulse or reaction. It can go very poorly and you can fall back to despondency. Wait a minute, I just wanted to live in silent wonder with my friends, but now they're all mad at me. Despondency. Or revelation. A person might have a revelation that they need to experience love more ongoingly. Well, you live in the West where there's a lot of ways to pursue love. I was just watching movies on the flight back from India, because you can. And I was trying to keep myself awake to get set up on the time change so I wouldn't have so much jet lag. And I watched a movie called The Life and Death of Peter Sellers. Yeah. Do you remember the part in the movie where he decides he's in love with Sophia Loren? And he goes home to tell his wife, I just don't love you as much as I love Sophia Loren. When he knows he wants to pursue love, he's already married with children, and he goes home to tell his wife, he's being very honest. He's also not that mature of a person, and he ends up causing a lot of suffering. So you can have a revelation and then go to reaction or impulse out of the conditioned mind. By the time Krishna decides it's okay to show his student the revelation, he's already exhausted his student's resistance. This is a really important point, because if the student was still in resistance, when he sees the revelation, he may not be willing to experience terror. He may not see the immensity and fall awestruck. And if that awestruck doesn't happen, he may not get to willingness. So if your revelations are coming very quickly, I would recommend that you linger a little longer. So revelation doesn't become something that the 99 ways in which the human mind goes out of balance. They're not just disguising revelations for you, like pushing up daisies from the ground. Some of our revelations are immature and they come out of conditioned mind, habit mind, less than dharmic mind. The revelation that hangs around, you can trust. The one that keeps haunting you. The revelation that causes the silent wonder or the awestruck trepidation is more trustworthy than the revelation that says, oh, I got it figured out now. I trust for each of us that the revelation that sticks around is meant to be the one you respond to. And that if there's a trustworthy enough revelation, even if you blink at it and it goes away, it will come back. Because it's sort of haunting you until you get it. You understand the distinction there, what I'm saying? It's okay. Have you guys seen the movie called The Raiders of the Lost Ark? Most of you have seen it. Did you see The Raiders of the Lost Ark?
I don't remember.
There's a moment in the movie when Harrison Ford, whose character's name I can't remember, he has to step out into the abyss. What happens when he puts his foot forward into the abyss?
Step appears.
A step appears. And then he puts the next foot forward into the abyss, and a step appears. The kind of trepidation that we experience from revelation to fear is like that trepidation. Oh my God, I'm looking into the abyss here. Everything I've prior known about myself or about life or about my conditioning now seems untrue or unskillful. And there's this big abyss of unknown awe. Am I willing to step into that? The trepidation that turns to willingness, we say, well, and the step that needs you to step on it, the step will appear. When he first got to that cliff in the movie, did a couple stones fall down to the abyss? Do you remember that part?
I don't remember the detail, the moment of that detail.
Something showed him that was like never-ending abyss. I think it was a rock or a stone. Something fell into the abyss already, and he recoiled before stepping out. He couldn't go back, however. So our friend Arjuna becomes willing, and then rather than the spectrum where will out onto the world becomes unskillful, or loss of your sense of will becomes too timid, he becomes willing. And the chakras rise at that point, so Arjuna moves from the third chakra to his heart, where he experiences compassion. And in his compassionate willingness, he takes action. Compassion overcomes the 99 ways in which the human mind goes out of balance.
Can you say that again?
Hmm?
Can you say that again?
Yeah, compassion. Once he moves to compassion, so his dharma is to be a warrior against these 100 cousins, to bring the kingdom back to righteousness, love, and grace. That is his required purpose as a warrior. So when he becomes willing, he moves into the heart, where compassion overcomes the 99 ways in which the human mind goes out of balance. The brother who represents the fourth chakra, his name is Bhima, and Bhima means love and compassion. Bhima is the fourth brother. The fifth brother's name is Yudhishthira. And Yudhi, Y-U-D-I, means war, and Sthira means steadiness. So Yudhishthira, once Arjuna goes from the third chakra, willing, to the fourth chakra of compassion, he moves to the fifth chakra, where his brother counsels him. Yudhishthira means the capacity to speak steadily even in times of conflict. The capacity to speak steadily even in times of conflict. So Arjuna's job right there is now from willingness to compassion to learn how to speak with compassion and clarity. Even when he's talking to the 99 ways in which the human mind goes out of balance. What do you think about that? How much time, if you were to think of like a pie chart, how much percentage of time do we practice speaking from willingness, compassion, and clarity? And how much time just random speaking? Mostly random speaking. And by the time we end up in conflict, are we speaking from willingness, compassion, and clarity? Most of us are speaking from reaction and discompassion, violence and willfulness, or loss of will. So we go on that spectrum again between too much will or too little will. What if the actions from willingness to compassion to clarity and the speech that accompanies them created more dharma in your life, not less? What would you have to nurture for that to be a possibility?
What would you have to nurture?
Yeah, for that to be a possibility, what needs to be nurtured now? What might you do less of to cultivate that possibility?
Nurture the willingness and tamp down the willfulness.
I would say yes, nurture the willingness. Towards our willfulness, if that's the way that we got conditioned, some of us got conditioned to be more willful, some got conditioned to be less willful, but towards whatever that strategy that life required of us at a certain time, towards that strategy I would recommend a compassionate response. Not really tamping it down like I think of the Wile E. Coyote cartoons, when he would tamp it back down into the Acme box, and then it would explode again, right? Because the tamping down like that can create an adverse reaction in the other direction. But to come to any one of our mental tendencies with compassion, that we are right now expressing the human condition as it shows up when it's out of balance, to come to that with compassion rather than trying to suppress or repress or make it bad or wrong or justify it or defend it. To come to it with compassion makes the heart larger, not more defended, more expansive, more understanding. So nurture our willingness to use compassion in every direction. Yeah.
How do you nurture that compassion?
I think there's two questions there. One is, how do I nurture the willingness for that to be my response? And the second is, how do I nurture compassion instead of, let's say, contraction? So to nurture the willingness, if you've sat, as Mataji was saying to us when we were in Rishikesh, she said, keep the company of sages. Means even when we come together, we're keeping the company of sages. So each of us in the room has an inner Krishna, an inner sage, an inner place of wisdom. And many of us also have teachers upstream in our lives. Like I have Mataji and Saraswati and Acharya and Ramana and Catherine and Christopher and Michael and teachers upstream in my life who inform me as I am today. And many of you have teachers upstream, so we are multiplied by the numbers of sages in this room right now. So what she meant there was, keep the company of sages so you're more often sitting in the wisdom teachings that tell us compassion is a more wise response than contraction. And willingness is more auspicious than willfulness. So if you put your ear to the ground for those teachings that have been time-tested for generations, and we see how that turns out in somebody's life, like my teachers' lives, the Dalai Lama's life, Thich Nhat Hanh's life, Nelson Mandela's life, when he went from willfulness to willingness, we see transformation. So keep the company of sages and look for the evidence that the teachings are working in the lives of people who can be our role models, who can be our light. Also look for the evidence of it in your own life. When you've been willing, when you've surrendered and something magnanimous or beautiful or luminous has happened as a result, make a positive samskara memory of that. Also notice what happens when you become willful or when you lose your will altogether. When you're on that other spectrum, what has happened? What's the outcome from that?
You get in trouble over the law.
You have more trouble, yeah. So if you look at the difference between when you've been willing and when you've been willful, or when you've lost your will altogether, you can start to see how karma, which is a big part of the Bhagavad-Gita, karma is real. It means actions have results. And we let that simmer to condition our willingness rather than our willfulness. Willingness is also like when we say, thy will be done rather than my will be done. What is that larger purpose in life? Willingness is also humility. If I don't know what to do or how to do it, humility asks me to pause. Is that helpful to some extent so far? Carrie's nodding, but I'm not sure that Pablo's...
A little bit, yeah.
Little bits. So let's say then on the 2 lower chakras, before I go back to compassion, if you want to nurture willingness at the 3rd chakra, tend more thoughtfully to the 1st and 2nd chakra. So 1st chakra, Sahadeva represents the 1st chakra. His name is Saha, means together. Deva means together in the divine. So to nurture that is to nurture your sense of Sangha. So your tribe, the community of people that you have confidence in are pursuing the wisdom teachings and want to give clear and heartfelt reflections back to each other to help promote that kind of growth. So Sahadeva is the 1st chakra, and the brother who reminds Arjuna he's a part of a larger tribe. We nurture that by nurturing our sense of root, grounding, tribe, community, stability. So if your life is chaotic, it's hard to experience the 1st chakra as sustaining you. The 2nd brother, these are the twins, Sahadeva and Nakula are twins. So the 2nd is the 2nd chakra, which is the center of sensuality, sweetness, creativity, generativeness, meaning what you generate in your life. So if the 1st chakra is well established and you have a sense of the 2nd chakra being available to life, life is creative with you. It expresses itself through you, like when a garden is fertile and it grows. And when the soil is not fertile or there's not enough water or sun or not the right plants or conditions, the garden doesn't grow. So we're tending first to tribe and then to our capacity for growth and creativity and our participation with nature. Since we are a part of nature, by the way, we aren't here to dominate nature. We are an aspect of nature. So if the 1st and 2nd chakra are more well tended to, we tend to arrive at the 3rd chakra with a sense of willingness, because we've seen the evidence of community and growth. We have some confidence that life can live itself through us. For those of us who didn't have a good, strong start in community or don't now have one, we might live more in isolation or feel more left out. It's really hard to have confidence that life wants to grow through you. It's just fundamental to the human brain that we hunger for a sense of belonging and security and safety in that. Sometimes I have to, convince some of my students when I've been teaching and they've had a lifelong experience that they don't have a place of belonging. I have this convincing technique. It starts with saying to them, you already belong to life. The evidence is here in the fact that you exist, that your skin cells are regenerating, that your eyelashes come in, that an eyelash falls out, that your heart is beating, that your body absorbs water. It already exists, and as such, your sense of belonging is unconditional. I say, oh no, I don't really believe you, because people have told me that I don't have value to them, or I'm not as worthwhile as people whose skin color is different than mine, or if I had more education or I did a better job at work, I would be more valuable to people. I said, no, let's go back to the most expansive perspective and see that by the fundamental fact that you actually exist, life wants you to be here. And wanted that from the moment of your conception. And it organized magically, it produced all these trillions of cells that turn out to be you, with fingers and toes, and ears and lips, and a belly button. And just as you're sitting here for the last hour, skin cells have sloughed off, and the liver's doing the liver job. And your eyes are turning the world right side up on the inside of your head so you can see each other. It's already working on your behalf. So I tell the students, even those who feel the most isolated, life is living itself through you and wants you to belong. It's already understood. Listen less often to human limitation and more often to the immensity of life that says you belong already. And then start nurturing that, and life does grow through us. If we're not hydrated, if we're not well balanced in our brain chemistry, if we haven't had some movement and some rest, if we haven't had some positive social connection, it's really hard for life to flourish in the human system. We don't need 3-hour workouts at the gym. You don't need to have power weights. You don't have to have a 6-pack abs or a flat stomach. You don't need cosmetic surgery. You don't have to have the perfect, auspicious, vegan, oxygenarian diet. You don't have to go to extremes. There's nothing to prove. You already exist. It needs to be nurtured with respect rather than made perfect. The indwelling intelligence in the body is limited when we try to impose on it how we think it should turn out. And then the first and second chakra are confused, and you get to the third chakra and people try to dominate their body, their thoughts, their life, their yoga, the outcomes of their actions. And that's called adharma, to live in the kingdom of suffering. So it may be, Pablo, for you to spend some time in the first and second chakra, and that willingness shows up as gratitude for life living itself through us, as appreciation for that. I will talk about compassion in a few moments, but I want to tell you this thing, my mantra when I'm in India. Inevitably, when you're in India, you will have body symptoms. You'll have body symptoms of some kind. You'll be too hot or too cold. You'll be too hungry or too full. Because the food is so good, people don't stop eating when they're full. Sometimes oh my God, I've eaten way past satiation. You'll also have muscle aches and pains. The seats will be too comfortable or too uncomfortable. Generally more uncomfortable than too comfortable. The roads are bouncy and it's noisy, and there's a lot of pollution everywhere. And you will have body symptoms beyond what you have here at home. Such as, for me, constant nose blowing. Like the constant generation of mucus, especially in the north where there was a lot more dust. I was telling them before you came, Joseph, how the rainy season didn't come in the north. They expect it in July. They wait for it in August. In September, they say it's on God's timing. In October, they had a little drizzle. The north was really dusty. And I blew my nose for 9 days without stopping. And like a lot of nose blowing. Joseph can attest to the volume of nose blowing that's coming from Jay and I. And so with every nose blow, you have to say, my body's doing what it knows how to do. My body is taking care of itself in the best way that it knows. And if you get some toxin in the system and the GI tract says, we need to get rid of this, you say, my body is doing what it knows how to do, it needs to do it pretty quickly, and it's going to take care of it. What am I going to do to help that along? If your body gets a headache, instead of it seeing it as a problem, you say, my body's trying to defend against something right now in the environment, and it's giving me a headache as a symptom. So everything in the body that surfaces is still life living itself in you, asking for your kind attention and appreciation. So to my capacity for generating mucus, I said, thank you. Thank you for the mucus that's trying to protect something in my sinuses from having too much pollution. You understand? If the eyeballs got dried out, that was one of Jay's concerns, well, the eyeball starts to be painful. So thank you for giving me the information that this is too dry for these eyeballs right now, and you get the eye drops. Or you can get liquid ghee and pour it in the eyes. We didn't use that technique, by the way. It was available at the ashram. I don't know if you saw that.
Yours, maybe? No, I didn't realize.
Yeah. So for everything, we can come back to actually experiencing gratitude that the body is producing these symptoms. And first chakra, second chakra, then you rise into willingness here. I think the way that expands your perspective makes compassion the next natural outcome. Because you start to see the interdependent, interbeing nature of life. And we start seeing that other humans are always also experiencing the human condition, doing the best that they can, given their constitution and their temperament and their conditioning and their life narrative as it's been lived. People are doing the best that they can. Even you, every one of you in the room, has ongoingly, day in and day out, been doing the best that you can. Even when you see yourself doing less than your best, you're still at each moment doing the best you can with the resources you have at the time, with the mixture of conviction and fear, commitment and trepidation, with the mixture of willingness and self-compassion, you're doing the best that you can at every moment. So I like to start developing compassion. Personally, I don't have a distinction between self-compassion and other compassion, because I look more at it as if these 100 representations of how the human mind goes out of balance, as each one of them was in me and also in you. We start with compassion for the seeds of the human condition. And there might be warm-up poses for you, like you might be able to be compassionate more towards a person's loneliness compared to their rage. Maybe it's easier for you to be compassionate towards someone's sorrow rather than their greed. But inevitably, the Gita is suggesting that compassion is for all 100 cousins. The ways in which the mind is inauspicious. So compassion for greed or power or violence, pettiness, selfishness, judgmentalness. Compassion for overindulgence. Compassion for the ugly and the inauspicious aspects of what happens to the human mind when it's been out of balance. In the story of the Gita, it's longer than 12 years, because they were already gambling before the 12-year exile. But what we see in others as, let's say, less than auspicious or ugly behavior, that's a call to action for us, to offer compassion towards that aspect of that person, expressing the human dilemma, and while still seeing the action and the person, the indwelling innocence and earnestness that might otherwise not have expressed itself that way had it had different conditions. But it's getting expressed like this, so we can express compassion towards that and bring ourselves back to seeing the underlying, indwelling human. The once innocent, earnest, and vulnerable human that might be disguising itself by this action that's offensive, so you want to move away from it. People who are acting in offensive ways may have an unconscious strategy to push you away from them by some indwelling loss of compassion or esteem or respect for themselves. It's worth having compassion for that in the other human. Do you understand what I said there?
It's like a defense mechanism.
Yeah. My teacher, one of my teachers is Catherine Ingram, and she was telling the story once of being in India. This story was one of the reasons I wanted to go to India a long time ago. She was telling the story of being on the train. The train in India is an event. We don't have time to talk about it right now, but some other time I'll tell you Indian train stories. But this train she'd been on, there was a loud, obnoxious, drunk man. This is unusual. In certain parts of India, it's totally alcohol-free, no alcohol, no meat. It's not a big deal. People are not actively using drugs or alcohol in India. In Mumbai, big cities, you'll see some of that, but it's just not a really common undertaking. So to have a loud, angry, drunk person on the train is unusual. And as the train gets to a certain destination, there's fewer and fewer people. So the loud, angry, drunk person became more obvious. The trains are so crowded that loud, angry, drunk person is muted by the other. There's hundreds of people on a train car that America would only allow for 10. Right? It's like the metro that we took into Old Delhi. So as the train got less populated, this person's behavior got more obvious. The behavior didn't go up in volume, its obviousness increased because there were fewer other people to pad it. And then it seemed like it was directed at the few people left on the train, because it was looking for an outlet. One of Catherine's traveling companions was a man, also studying Buddhism in India. This was 40 years ago. And this man approached the loud, angry, drunk man and asked him what he was sad about. And they sat on the train, and he told Catherine's friend that his wife had recently died, and he had felt devastated and lonely. And after a few moments' conversation, the companion to my friend Catherine had that loud, angry, drunk man crying on his shoulder. It was a total transformation of the man's anger into sorrow, as expressed first by Catherine's friend, a male friend, moving towards the angry, violent man, moving towards, not away from the offensive behavior, but towards it. Well, Catherine and her friend, I think it was either Joseph or Jack, by the way, Joseph Goldstein or Jack Kornfield, she was traveling with them at the time. They were studying Buddhism and loving kindness and compassion, and he chose to put it to use. And it transformed the moment. So when people's behavior seems offensive, it might be a call for us to either silently lean towards them with compassion or actually lean towards them with compassion. Sometimes the vulnerability underneath the offensive behavior is so great that if you actually step towards, the reaction gets bigger like a porcupine. So you have to sometimes reserve yourself to just the silent response of compassion. And there will be times when you can do more than that, without overwhelming the person whose vulnerability has turned into offensive behavior, and might get more vulnerable when being seen with compassion. Do you understand the distinction there?
Yeah, you know, when I went up to the guy with the big weights to explain what was happening, he was a really gentle young man. He, matter of fact, put his hand out and shook my hand, but he was very gentle and open to waiting 2 minutes or whatever. And to see that was nice because it was so loud, you know, so offensive. So when I went in, I explained, wow, he was a really nice guy. Let's send him, you know, a gentle, compassionate, whatever it was I said. But it was nice to see that because going from being kind of annoyed with trying to teach this meditation while these weights were being dropped on the ground, and then to go up to him and see what a gentle young man was, very sweet and young man. And he was not trying to hurt anybody. He was just doing his work the way he does it. So it was good. And then it was good to be able to go back and share that with the students.
Yeah. So a question remains for us before we come towards closing, and that question is, let's say you have a revelation now as a result of being here, that compassion towards yourself, and specifically towards aspects of yourself that you find offensive. Let's say you have a revelation that would be a dharmic response. To be compassionate towards something in yourself that you now find offensive. As I say that, notice any reaction in your mind that shows up as resistance. Does it happen to anybody? Yeah. And is there any fear associated with being compassionate towards that part of you that can sometimes be offensive? Yeah. This is a natural friction. We've been discompassionate with this particular part of ourselves. The teachings would say be compassionate. Put those two things together. Discompassion and compassion are in friction. You've already tried discompassion. Is that the case? How has that turned out? That was a good facial expression, Carrie. Yeah. If you've already been less than tender, less than kind, less than compassionate, if you've already been annoyed, frustrated, belligerent towards an aspect of yourself that has been offensive or has caused you some trouble personally or interpersonally, if you've already tried that and you've seen that it doesn't turn out that well, you've been living the adharmic path. And the Gita is suggesting the dharmic response. And of course, I understand that if you've been, let's say, less than kind or less than tender, even belligerent towards that part of yourself, you were trying that strategy to keep it out of circulation. So it wouldn't cause so much trouble in your mind or your life or your relationships. If you've ever tried to push away a very interested and earnest cat, and it wants to be pet, or a dog that wants to lick your face and you keep pushing it away, does it come back? incessantly, consistently. Sometimes it's also you do it with a child and then their tantrum gets louder because you're trying to push away the thing that's actually happening and their expression can get bigger. So the pushing away may sometimes cause that offensive behavior to get louder, to become more problematic. It may be a source of information for you, asking for your attention. It may be that offensive nugget in you is the doorway to compassion for others who also have that nugget. And it may be that if you stop pushing it away, it becomes less incessant and you've got more internal real estate then for other qualities of you to emerge. We spend a lot of time wrestling with what we don't want to be in our minds. We spend less time cultivating what we do want. Is that the case for some of you? I'm making a guess here about human nature. So I would leave you with this question, and we'll sit in quiet for the question, with the question again about being compassionate towards an aspect, a really specific aspect of who you've been or how you've been that's been offensive or problematic or out of balance. So let's sit for a few minutes. Once we settle in, I'll give you the echo of the questions again for your consideration. But first, make yourself relatively comfortable, relatively stable, and relatively quiet. You're welcome to close your eyes or to have your gaze be down or restful. The palms might be face down in your lap, a little quieter for the mind, or you can cup one hand in the palm of the other. Lift the base of your skull, and as you slightly tip the chin down, whether your eyes are soft or closed, drop your gaze down into your heart. And visualize in your heart your innate capacity for compassion, your innate and abundant capacity for compassion. You might imagine that compassion as the light that comes from a candle flame, burning not too brightly, not with too much flicker, and not about to smolder. Visualize that candle flame as steady and luminous. As you imagine the innate compassion of your own heart, if it's a little dim this evening, you might have to borrow from a great being who's been a compassionate presence on the planet. And imagine how their heart would shine through your heart. Maybe one of your teachers, or a world presence like Gandhi or the Dalai Lama. And as you visualize this quality of compassion, steady and expansive and luminous, now bring to mind one aspect of your mental conditioning, something that you're sometimes troubled by. Maybe your sense of urgency or petulance or greed. Maybe sometimes you're less than kind. Maybe sometimes you act in ways that are harmful. Bring to mind one aspect. And consider, as you bring that to mind, placing that aspect now in your heart, in the light of compassion. How might this aspect of your mental pattern be offered compassion, and how might it respond? And as you consider offering this aspect of your mind to the light of compassion, if resistance or fear emerge, just understand that that's part of the process of coming back to willingness and then to compassion itself. And before we close, you can make a silent and personal commitment to explore compassion for this aspect of your mind as it emerges in the days to come. And in honoring that commitment, please join your hands into Anjali Mudra. Notice that when you bring the palms together, if you leave a tiny space between the center of the palms, the hands look like a small flame, a candle flame on the inside. And with appreciation for the innate compassion of your own heart, you may bow your head to your heart. Thank you, everyone. Namaste.
Namaste.